You know it's going to be a weird day when you find 30 strangers standing in your front yard, led by a woman dressed like a failed news anchor holding a stack of legal threats. I thought they were lost. Turns out, they thought I was the one trespassing, on the ranch my grandfather built with his bare hands. The HOA queen in pink heels told me I had 30 days to leave her community, cute considering her precious clubhouse is sitting on my dirt. They wanted to fight over fences and cow poop. What they got was a legal landmine buried under manicured lawns and fake smiles. Drop a comment if you've ever been told to leave your own home. Because what happened next? Well, let's just say they picked the wrong rancher. I'm Cole Granger, 41 years old, and I've been living on this ranch in Cedar Ridge, Texas for the past 3 years. It's not much to look at from the outside, just a modest house, some outbuildings, and about 50 head of cattle grazing on land that stretches as far as you can see. But this place means everything to me. After my divorce 3 years ago, when I lost custody of my daughter Emma because the court said I lived too far from civilization, this ranch became my sanctuary. I only get to see Emma on weekends now, and every time she visits, she runs straight to the pasture to pet the cows and help me with the morning chores. The land has been in my family since the 1960s, passed down from my grandfather, who built everything here with his bare hands after coming back from Vietnam. That particular Tuesday morning started like any other. I was watching the sun rise, paint the sky orange and pink, thinking about how peaceful everything felt, when I heard those heels clicking across my front yard. The woman approaching my door was something else entirely. She had blonde hair teased up like it was still 1985. Makeup so thick it looked like she'd applied it with a spatula, and a bright pink blazer that probably cost more than I spend on feed in 6 months. In her hand, she carried what looked like a legal document, and her smile was the kind that salespeople practice in the mirror. "Good morning," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm here on behalf of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. We need to discuss some serious violations happening on this property." I stared at her, completely confused. Homeowners Association? Ma'am, I think you've got the wrong address. I don't belong to any HOA. She laughed, a sound like glass breaking, and waved her papers at me. "Oh, but you do, honey. This entire area falls under our jurisdiction, and frankly, your ranch is completely out of compliance with our community standards." The way she said ranch made it sound like I was running a garbage dump. She handed me a thick packet of papers titled Notice of Community Violations and started reading from a list. Inappropriate livestock on residential property, non-compliant fencing materials, unauthorized agricultural structures, improper landscaping that detracts from neighborhood aesthetics. The list went on and on, 12 different violations in total. "This is ridiculous," I said, flipping through the papers. "My grandfather built this place before any of these houses existed. We've been here for 60 years. She just smiled that practiced smile again and adjusted her oversized fake pearl necklace. "Well, times change, sweetheart. We're trying to build a modern, upscale community here, and your operation simply doesn't fit our vision. You have 30 days to bring everything into compliance, or we'll be forced to take more serious action." I felt my blood pressure rising, remembering how the family court had used similar language when they decided I wasn't fit to have full custody of Emma. "And what exactly does serious action mean?" I asked. Her smile got even whiter, showing teeth so white they probably glowed in the dark. "Legal action, of course. We have the full backing of local authorities, and trust me, we don't lose these battles." After she strutted back to her white Mercedes SUV, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume hanging in the morning air, I stood on my porch, holding those papers, and feeling like I'd just been sucker punched. The violations list was ridiculous. Apparently my fence was the wrong color, I had the wrong type of grass, and my cattle were creating an unsightly agricultural presence in a residential zone. But what bothered me most was the complete arrogance of it all. This woman, whoever she was, had waltzed onto my family's land and told me I didn't belong here. It reminded me too much of losing Emma, of being told I wasn't good enough, that my way of life wasn't acceptable. I wasn't about to let that happen again. That evening, I called my old friend Nate Whitaker, the only lawyer I knew personally. Nate's dad had run the local garage for 30 years, and Nate had worked there through high school before putting himself through law school. He specialized in real estate law, particularly the kind of rural property disputes that seem to pop up more and more as suburbs expand into farm country. Cole, he said when I explained the situation, this sounds fishy as hell. Send me everything they gave you and let me do some digging. If there really is an HOA with jurisdiction over your property, there should be records going back to when it was established. I faxed him the papers that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening here. Something I didn't understand yet. I spent the next few days going through every box of documents my grandfather had left behind, looking for any mention of homeowners associations or community agreements. Most of it was routine stuff: property deeds, tax records, maintenance logs for the water and electrical systems he'd installed. But buried in an old filing cabinet, I found something interesting: a hand-drawn map of the entire area, dated 1964, with my grandfather's handwriting marking various landmarks and property boundaries. At the bottom of the map, in his careful script, were the words, "The lifeblood of Cedar Ridge." I had no idea what that meant, but something told me it was important. As I folded the map carefully and put it aside, I couldn't help wondering what other secrets my grandfather had left behind. The next morning, I took that old map and walked the entire perimeter of my property, trying to understand what my grandfather had meant by the lifeblood of Cedar Ridge. Following the hand-drawn lines and notations, I discovered something I'd never really paid attention to before: a series of underground pipes and electrical conduits that didn't just serve my ranch, but seemed to extend far beyond my property lines. My grandfather had been an electrical engineer before the war, and when he came back to Texas, he'd built one of the most sophisticated private utility systems I'd ever seen. What I found that day changed everything I thought I knew about my little piece of land. The system was incredible. Hidden beneath pastures and tucked behind outbuildings were water treatment facilities, electrical generators, and distribution networks that my grandfather had constructed over decades. Following the map, I realized that every house in the Cedar Ridge development, or probably 60 or 70 homes by now, was getting their water and electricity through systems that originated right here on my ranch. The municipal utilities only served as backup. The primary source for everything was the infrastructure my grandfather had built. No wonder my utility bills were always so low. I wasn't just self-sufficient, I was apparently providing power and water to half the county without even knowing it. I called Nate immediately. "You need to get out here," I told him. "I found something that changes everything." When Nate arrived that afternoon, I walked him through the entire system, showing him the generator buildings disguised as barn storage, the water treatment facility hidden behind a grove of oak trees, and the network of underground cables and pipes that stretched in every direction. Nate was a smart guy, but even he was impressed by the scope of what my grandfather had built. "Cole," he said, studying the map and comparing it to the property surveys, "do you realize what this means? You're not just living on this land, you're literally keeping the lights on for the entire neighborhood." According to the records Nate pulled up, my grandfather hadn't just been a private citizen building his own utilities. He'd been contracted by the original developers of Cedar Ridge to provide infrastructure for the entire planned community. The agreements, dating back to 1968, gave him not just the right but the obligation to provide water and electrical service to all properties in the development. In exchange, he received utility fees from each household, fees that, according to the contracts, should have been transferred to me when I inherited the property. "Cole," Nate said, his voice getting excited, "according to these documents, every house in Cedar Ridge owes you approximately $50 a month in utility fees. That's been going on for over 20 years since your grandfather died." While we were discovering the extent of my grandfather's utility empire, the woman from the HOA, I still didn't know her name at that point, was apparently launching her own campaign. Nate had done some investigating and found out she was Veronica Greaves, a former local television personality who'd been fired from her morning show job about 8 months earlier. She had apparently decided that becoming the self-appointed queen of the Cedar Ridge HOA was her path back to relevance and authority. She'd been busy on social media, creating online groups and posting dramatic videos about protecting our community standards and dealing with problem properties that threaten our property values. The more I learned about Veronica Greaves, the more I understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't just someone who disliked having a ranch in her neighborhood. This was someone who'd lost control of her career and was desperately trying to regain power and attention through whatever means necessary. Her social media posts were becoming increasingly aggressive, featuring photos of my property taken from the road and commentary about dangerous agricultural operations in residential areas. She was building a narrative, trying to turn my neighbors against me before I even knew there was a fight happening. What really got to me was thinking about Emma. She was supposed to visit that weekend, and I could already imagine her asking why people were saying bad things about our ranch on the internet. The last thing I wanted was for my daughter to feel ashamed of the place that had become our refuge together. Every weekend she'd help me feed the cattle, collect eggs from the chickens, and we'd sit on the front porch talking about her week at school. This ranch wasn't just my home, it was the foundation of my relationship with my daughter. I wasn't about to let some failed television personality destroy that. That night, Nate had found references to something called a cultural heritage designation in the original property agreements, but the details were buried in county records that would take time to access. Whatever my grandfather had set up, it was more complex and far-reaching than either of us had initially realized. As I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sitting on information that would completely change the balance of power in this fight. I just needed to figure out how to use it. The Cedar Ridge Community Center was a beautiful building, all glass and modern architecture, sitting right in the middle of what used to be my grandfather's east pasture. I didn't think much about that detail at the time. I was too focused on preparing for my first HOA meeting and trying to understand exactly what I was walking into. Nate had advised me to attend, observe, and ask questions, but not to reveal anything about what we'd discovered regarding the utility systems. Let them show their hand first, he'd said, then we'll know exactly what kind of game they're playing. Walking into that meeting was like stepping onto the set of a daytime talk show. Veronica Greaves had positioned herself at the front of the room, behind a polished wooden podium, with professional lighting equipment and what looked like multiple camera angles set up around the space. She was dressed like she was hosting a television program, complete with a wireless microphone headset and a stack of presentation materials that looked more like television production notes than HOA business. About 40 residents were scattered throughout the room, most of them looking as confused as I felt about the elaborate setup. "Welcome, everyone, to our special community standards meeting," Veronica announced, her television personality voice echoing through speakers mounted around the room. "Tonight we're going to address a serious issue that affects every single property owner in Cedar Ridge. The problem of incompatible land use that's threatening our property values and community vision." She clicked a remote control, and a large screen behind her lit up with aerial photos of my ranch, clearly taken from a drone. The way she presented it, you'd think I was running a toxic waste facility instead of raising cattle and growing hay. The presentation was impressive, I had to admit. Veronica had charts showing property values in similar communities, before and after photos of successful community improvements, and what appeared to be professional architectural renderings of how the area could look once properly developed. She talked about attracting high-quality residents and creating a cohesive, aesthetic vision that would make Cedar Ridge a destination community. Every few minutes, she'd pause dramatically and look directly into one of the cameras, as if she was delivering a monologue to a television audience rather than talking to her neighbors. About halfway through her presentation, a man I'd never seen before joined her at the front of the room. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from years of getting his way through official channels. "I'd like to introduce my husband, Stuart Greaves," Veronica announced. "He's a land use consultant who works with municipal planning departments throughout Texas, and he's here tonight to explain the legal framework we're operating under." Stuart's presentation was more subdued than his wife's theatrical performance, but equally concerning. He talked about zoning regulations, community development standards, and the legal mechanisms available to homeowners associations for addressing non-compliant properties. When Veronica opened the floor for questions, I stood up. "I've got a few questions," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "First, I'd like to see the legal documents that establish this HOA's jurisdiction over my property. Second, I'd like to understand how long this association has existed and who authorized its creation. And third, I'm curious about the history of this building we're meeting in, specifically what was here before it was built." The room got very quiet, and I could see Veronica and Stuart exchanging glances. "Those are all very technical questions," Veronica said, her television smile looking a little strained. "Perhaps we could discuss them after the meeting." But I wasn't finished. "Actually, I think these are exactly the kind of questions that should be discussed in front of the entire community," I continued. "If we're going to make decisions about property rights and community standards, shouldn't everyone understand the legal and historical context?" That's when Stewart stepped forward and made what I now realize was a crucial mistake. "Mr. Granger," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "I understand that you're attached to your lifestyle, but you need to understand that times change. This area is developing into something much more valuable than agricultural land." As the meeting continued, it became clear that Veronica and Stewart had already made up their minds about what needed to happen. They talked about preliminary architectural studies and development timelines as if my ranch was already gone. After the meeting ended, I lingered in the parking lot, watching as they packed up their equipment. That's when I overheard something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. Stewart was on his phone, apparently talking to someone about the timeline for the ranch acquisition and keeping the development schedule on track. He mentioned something about preliminary site preparation and infrastructure assessment, language that sounded like they were already planning construction before they'd even gotten me off the property. The retaliation started the very next morning. I was having coffee on my front porch when I saw the first inspector walking around my property with a clipboard and camera. When I asked what he was doing, he handed me an official-looking document titled Community Standards Compliance Assessment and explained that he was conducting a comprehensive evaluation of all the violations identified by the HOA. Over the next 2 weeks, these inspections became a daily occurrence, different people showing up at different times, always with cameras, clipboards, and official-sounding explanations for documenting everything on my property. They'd measure fence posts, photograph my cattle, and take notes about everything from the color of my barn to the height of my grass. What made it worse was the constant stream of violation notices that started arriving in my mail. The first major one hit me hard, a fine for $800 because my fence was non-compliant natural wood instead of approved white vinyl. The next day, another notice arrived, citing me for inappropriate livestock noise after my cattle had the audacity to moo during their morning inspection. But the one that really got to me was the notice about my unauthorized vegetable garden. They were fining me $500 for the small plot where I grew tomatoes and peppers for Emma and me to enjoy during her weekend visits. By the end of the second week, I had accumulated over $18,000 in HOA fines for violations that seemed designed to attack every aspect of the life my grandfather had built here. The situation escalated dramatically when Stewart made a phone call that I later learned was completely illegal. Posing as a representative of the Cedar Ridge Community Association, he contacted my electric and water utilities and filed formal complaints claiming that my property was creating safety hazards that required immediate service disconnection. He apparently had just enough official-sounding paperwork and municipal connections to convince the utility companies to take his complaints seriously. On a Thursday morning in early October, I woke up to find that both my electricity and water had been shut off. The utility trucks were parked in my driveway, and the workers explained that they'd received official complaints about code violations and safety issues that required immediate service termination. When I tried to explain that I'd never been contacted about any safety issues, they just shrugged and said they were following standard procedures for responding to municipal complaints. And that Friday evening, as I sat in my dark house, using candles for light and rationing bottled water, I heard Emma's voice on the phone when she called to confirm her weekend visit. "Daddy, are you okay? Mom says there might be problems with your house." The pain in her 10-year-old voice cut through me like a knife. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I lied. "We might have to camp out this weekend like we're on an adventure." But I could hear the worry in her voice when she asked, "Are the bad people going to make you leave the ranch, Daddy? Are we not going to have our special place anymore?" That night, sitting in the darkness and listening to my cattle settling down for the evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to run away from this fight. I wasn't going to let Veronica and Stewart drive me off my family's land, the same way the family court had driven me away from daily custody of my daughter. Whatever it took, however long it took, I was going to find a way to fight back. Emma's words echoed in my head, "Our special place." This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about protecting the one place where my daughter and I could be together, where she could learn about her family's history, where she felt safe and loved. Before going to bed that night, I opened the small wooden box Emma had given me for my birthday last year. Inside was a handmade bracelet, braided from blue and brown string. Cow and sky colors, she'd called them. In the center was a little button she'd glued on, etched with messy handwriting that read, "Our Ranch, Forever." I held it in my hand, running my fingers over the rough texture. It hit me then. This fight wasn't just mine anymore. This ranch wasn't just a place to raise cattle. It was where my daughter felt grounded. Not the city, not the polished homes in the development, but here, with the smell of hay, the low hum of livestock, and long afternoons sketching the cows on the porch. I realized that if I let these people take this place, I wouldn't just be giving up land. I'd be giving up our bond, our history, our peace. Tomorrow, I'd start fighting back. And this time, I wouldn't just be doing it for me. I'd be doing it for Emma, for my grandfather, and for every quiet, stubborn voice that ever stood up to a bully and said, "Not today." Little did I know that the answer was literally right beneath my feet. Hidden in the infrastructure my grandfather had built decades before any of these people had ever heard of Cedar Ridge. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone rang. It was Nate Whitaker, and he sounded more excited than I'd heard him since law school graduation. "Cole," he said, his voice barely containing his enthusiasm, "you need to get down to my office right now. I found something that's going to change everything." I threw on clothes and drove through the dark streets of Cedar Ridge, past the darkened houses of neighbors who had no idea that their comfortable suburban lives were about to be turned upside down. Nate's office was lit up like Christmas morning, with documents spread across every surface and his computer screens showing what looked like decades of property records, utility agreements, and municipal filings. "Sit down," he said, pouring me a cup of coffee that was probably his sixth of the night. "What I'm about to show you is going to blow your mind." He handed me a folder containing photocopies of documents I'd never seen before, contracts, agreements, and legal filings that painted a completely different picture of my grandfather's relationship with Cedar Ridge. "Your grandfather wasn't just a private citizen who built his own utilities," Nate explained, pulling up a series of property maps on his computer. "He was the original infrastructure developer for the entire Cedar Ridge planned community. Look at this." The maps showed property boundaries going back to 1964, when my grandfather had purchased not just the land where my ranch sits now, but 85% of what is now the Cedar Ridge development. Over the years, he'd sold individual lots to developers and home builders, but he'd retained ownership of all the land underneath, what lawyers call subsurface rights. But that wasn't the most important discovery. Hidden in the original development agreements was something called a Cultural Heritage Preservation Clause that my grandfather had insisted on including in every property sale. The clause designated the entire area as a historical agricultural preserve, and specifically prohibited any construction over 3 stories tall anywhere within the development boundaries. "Cole," Nate said, grinning like he just won the lottery, "this means that Stuart and Veronica's entire development plan, all those high-rise condos and commercial buildings they've been talking about, is completely illegal." Even more shocking was what Nate had discovered about the utility systems. Every house in Cedar Ridge was indeed connected to infrastructure that originated on my property, but the legal arrangements were much more complex than we'd initially realized. According to the original agreements, each property owner was supposed to pay monthly utility fees directly to whoever owned the source property, which meant they were supposed to be paying me $50 per month every month since I'd inherited the ranch 3 years ago. We're talking about 68 households, Nate calculated, paying $50 per month for 36 months. That's over $120,000 in unpaid utility fees. But the real bombshell was what Nate had discovered about the Cedar Ridge Community Center, the building where Veronica had been hosting her theatrical HOA meetings. According to the property records, the community center had been built on land that was never actually sold by my grandfather. Through some kind of clerical error or fraudulent paperwork, the building had been constructed on property that legally still belonged to me. "Cole," Nate said, his voice getting serious, "that building is sitting on your land without your permission. Technically, Veronica has been trespassing every time she holds a meeting there." As the full scope of the situation became clear, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The power that comes from having the law on your side instead of working against you. For the past month, I'd been playing defense, reacting to Veronica and Stuart's attacks and trying to figure out how to survive their harassment campaign. But now I realized I'd been fighting with one hand tied behind my back, completely unaware of the legal and financial advantages that had been sitting there waiting for me to discover them. Nate had already begun preparing the paperwork we'd need to assert my rights, First, we'd send formal notice to every household in Cedar Ridge, informing them of the unpaid utility fees and demanding immediate payment. Second, we'd file a trespass complaint against the Cedar Ridge Community Association and demand that they stop using my property for their meetings. Third, we'd notify the Municipal Planning Department about the Cultural Heritage Preservation Clause and request that they stop any development permits that violated the height restrictions. But here's the beautiful part, Nate said, showing me the final piece of documentation he'd uncovered. Your grandfather apparently anticipated exactly this kind of situation. Look at this clause buried in the original agreements. He pointed to a paragraph of dense legal language that basically said if anyone tried to use harassment, intimidation, or fraudulent legal claims to force the property owner off the land, all utility agreements would be immediately terminated and all unpaid fees would become due immediately with penalties and interest. As I drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, I couldn't help but smile, thinking about my grandfather's wisdom and foresight. He'd built not just a ranch and a utility system, but a legal fortress that would protect his family's land for generations. The irony was perfect. Veronica Greaves had spent weeks trying to use official paperwork and legal intimidation to drive me off my property. She'd filed violation notices, imposed fines, and even managed to get my utilities shut off through fraudulent complaints. But what she didn't know was that I owned the very ground she was standing on, controlled the utilities that kept her neighbors' lights on, and had legal agreements that made her entire development scheme impossible. Tomorrow morning, it would be my turn to start handing out official notices and making demands. The regular monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, and I made sure to arrive early. I brought Nate with me, along with a portable projector, a laptop computer, and 3 boxes of documentation that represented 60 years of carefully preserved legal records. When Veronica saw me setting up equipment at the back of the room, her perfectly practiced television smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. She had no idea what was about to hit her. The meeting started with Veronica's usual theatrical performance. She'd actually brought more camera equipment this time, apparently planning to record what she thought would be my public humiliation and eventual surrender. She began with a presentation about progress in addressing community violations and showed new photos of my property, along with a detailed timeline of all the fines and penalties I'd supposedly accumulated. According to her calculations, I now owed the HOA over $25,000 in violation fees, and she had obtained legal opinions stating that the association could place liens on my property to collect unpaid fines. But tonight, Veronica announced dramatically, looking directly into her main camera, we're going to resolve this situation once and for all. We have given Mr. Granger every opportunity to comply with reasonable community standards, and he has chosen to ignore our authority at every turn. Therefore, the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association is formally demanding that he vacate the property within 30 days, or we will begin foreclosure proceedings to recover our costs and protect our community's interests. The room was dead silent. About 60 residents had shown up for what they thought would be the final confrontation between the HOA and the stubborn rancher who refused to modernize. Several people were holding their phones up to record the moment when I would finally admit defeat and agree to sell my land to Stewart's Development Company. Instead, I stood up, smiled politely, and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Greaves. Now I'd like to present some information that I think everyone here needs to see." I connected my laptop to the projector and began with a simple property map showing the original boundaries of my grandfather's land purchase in 1964. What you're looking at, I explained to the suddenly attentive audience, is a map showing that my family owns 85% of the land underneath every house in this room. I clicked to the next slide showing the current property boundaries overlaid on the original purchase. Every lot in Cedar Ridge was sold by my grandfather over a period of 30 years, but he retained what are called subsurface rights to the entire area. The mood in the room was shifting rapidly, from anticipation to confusion to growing alarm. I clicked through slides showing the utility agreements, the infrastructure maps, and the legal documents establishing my family's ongoing rights and responsibilities as the utility provider for the entire development. For the past 3 years, I continued, every household here has been receiving water and electricity through systems located on my property, powered by generators my grandfather built and supplied through distribution networks that he designed and maintained until his death. Veronica tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. According to the original utility agreements, each household in Cedar Ridge is supposed to pay $50 per month in utility fees to the property owner. For 68 households over 36 months, that comes to approximately $122,400 in unpaid fees. I could see people in the audience pulling out their phones, probably to check their property deeds and utility bills. Of course, I'm willing to work out reasonable payment plans, and I'm not interested in charging interest or penalties for past due amounts. But I wasn't finished. The next slide showed the Cultural Heritage Preservation Clause that prohibited any construction over 3 stories tall anywhere in the development. This means, I said, looking directly at Stewart, that every high-rise development plan you've been promoting is legally impossible. The height restrictions are written into every property deed in Cedar Ridge, and they cannot be changed without the unanimous consent of all property owners, including me. The room erupted. People were talking over each other, asking questions, making accusations, and demanding explanations from Veronica and Stewart. Several residents stood up and started reading from their property deeds on their phones, apparently discovering restrictions and clauses they'd never noticed before. Others were calculating how much they might owe in utility fees and wondering why their mortgage companies and real estate agents had never mentioned any of this. Then I dropped the final bombshell. "There's one more thing everyone needs to know," I said, clicking to a slide showing the property survey for the community center. "This building we're meeting in tonight was constructed on land that was never actually sold by my grandfather. According to county property records, the Cedar Ridge Community Center is sitting on property that legally belongs to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Every meeting that's been held here, every HOA decision that's been made in this building has been conducted on private property without the owner's permission. Veronica finally found her voice, but the television personality confidence was completely gone. This is ridiculous," she stammered. "We have legal authorization to operate this HOA. We have municipal backing for our community standards. You cannot just come in here and..." But she couldn't finish the sentence because she was starting to realize that everything she'd built her authority on was crumbling around her. Stewart tried to support her, pulling out his own folder of documents, but Nate was ready for him. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Residents were demanding answers about utility fees, development restrictions, and property rights. Several people confronted Veronica about the thousands of dollars in fines she'd been imposing, wanting to know where that money had gone and whether the HOA had any legal authority to collect it in the first place. Others surrounded Stewart, asking pointed questions about his development plans and whether he'd been honest about the legal feasibility of his projects. As people filed out of the building, many of them stopped to apologize to me and to ask questions about how to resolve the utility fee situation. But Veronica wasn't finished fighting. As she packed up her camera equipment, she looked directly at me and said, "This isn't over, Mr. Granger. We will see you in federal court." 3 weeks after what the local newspaper called the Cedar Ridge revelation, Veronica Greaves made good on her threat to take me to federal court. She filed a lawsuit claiming that I was using fraudulent property claims and intimidation tactics to extort money from innocent homeowners. The lawsuit demanded that the court invalidate all the utility agreements, remove the cultural heritage restrictions, and award damages to the HOA for disruption of legitimate community development projects. She also requested a restraining order that would prevent me from collecting utility fees or restricting access to the community center. What Veronica didn't know was that Nate and I had spent those 3 weeks preparing for exactly this scenario. We had copies of every document, backup records from multiple sources, and testimony from several retired county officials who remembered my grandfather and the original development agreements. We also had something that Veronica didn't expect: recordings of every conversation I'd had with the fake inspectors who'd been harassing me, including several instances where they'd admitted to being hired by Stewart rather than representing any legitimate government agency. The federal court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in downtown Austin. I arrived to find Veronica dressed like she was anchoring the evening news, accompanied by Stewart and 2 expensive-looking lawyers who'd apparently been hired to intimidate me into settling out of court. They had charts, presentation materials, and what looked like a full media strategy designed to portray me as a land-grabbing opportunist who was taking advantage of elderly residents and legal technicalities. But federal judges don't care about television production values or dramatic presentations. Judge Patricia Hernandez was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years dealing with property disputes, and she'd clearly done her homework before the hearing. When Veronica's lawyers began their presentation about frivolous property claims, Judge Hernandez interrupted them. "Counselor," she said, looking over her reading glasses, "before we proceed with allegations of fraud, I'd like to see some evidence that these property claims are actually fraudulent." That's when Nate stood up and began presenting our documentation. He started with the original property deeds from 1964, moved through the utility agreements and development contracts, and finished with the cultural heritage preservation clauses that were recorded with the county clerk and attached to every property deed in Cedar Ridge. "Your Honor," Nate said, "these aren't new claims or legal technicalities. These are property rights and contractual obligations that have been legally established and publicly recorded for over 50 years. Judge Hernandez spent nearly an hour reviewing our documents, asking detailed questions about dates, signatures, and legal procedures. She also listened to the recordings we'd made of Stewart's inspectors, admitting that they weren't government officials and that they'd been hired to harass me into abandoning my property. When she heard Stewart himself on tape discussing acquisition timelines and preliminary site preparation before he'd even attempted to negotiate a legitimate purchase, her expression grew noticeably less patient. "Mr. Greaves," Judge Hernandez said, looking directly at Stewart, "these recordings suggest that you and your wife engaged in what appears to be systematic harassment designed to force Mr. Granger off his property so that you could acquire it below market value for your development projects. Is that an accurate characterization of your activities?" Stewart's expensive lawyers tried to object, but the judge wasn't interested in hearing excuses. "Furthermore," she continued, "the evidence suggests that your HOA has been operating on private property without permission and collecting fines under false pretenses. That's not a civil property dispute, that's potentially criminal fraud." The hearing ended with Judge Hernandez not only dismissing Veronica's lawsuit, but also ordering her to pay all court costs and legal fees, a total of nearly $35,000. She also issued a restraining order, preventing Veronica, Stewart, or anyone acting on their behalf from entering my property or attempting to collect any HOA fines from Cedar Ridge residents. "Mrs. Greaves," the judge said in her final remarks, "if you want to operate a homeowners association, I suggest you limit your activities to property that you actually have legal authority over." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within a week of the court ruling, Veronica and Stewart had put their Cedar Ridge house up for sale and announced they were moving to Arizona. Veronica's social media accounts, which had been full of dramatic posts about fighting for community rights, went silent overnight. Several residents told me they'd heard rumors that she was trying to start a video blog about HOA corruption, but apparently she wasn't having much success building an audience. The Cedar Ridge community, meanwhile, began the process of reorganizing itself without the Greaves leadership. A group of reasonable residents formed a new, legitimate homeowners association focused on actual community issues like road maintenance, snow removal, and organizing neighborhood events. They elected Sarah Mitchell, a retired school principal, as their president, and their first official act was to negotiate a fair utility agreement with me, $50 per household per month, which was exactly what the original agreements had specified. Most of the residents were relieved to finally understand the truth about their property rights and utility arrangements. A few grumbled about having to pay utility fees they hadn't known about, but when I offered to upgrade and modernize the entire system using the back payments, most people agreed it was a fair deal. I used part of the money to install solar panels and battery storage systems that made the entire development more energy sufficient and environmentally friendly. The best part of the whole experience, though, was Emma's reaction when she visited the weekend after the court hearing. She'd heard some of the story from her mother, and she was fascinated by the idea that our ranch was connected to all the houses in the neighborhood. "So you're like the king of electricity and water," she asked, grinning. "Does that make me a princess?" I told her that made her something even better, the future owner of a property that would always be protected from people who tried to take advantage of others. But what really made me proud was what she said next. "Daddy, I'm glad you didn't let the mean lady make us leave our special place. This ranch is where I feel closest to Great-Grandpa, and it's where you and I have our best talks." She paused, looking out at the cattle grazing in the evening light. "I was scared we were going to lose all of this. That's when I realized that Emma had understood far more about what was at stake than I'd given her credit for. Her fear of losing our special place had been one of the driving forces that kept me fighting when everything seemed hopeless. 6 months later, I received a letter from a town in New Mexico where the residents were having problems with an aggressive HOA that was trying to force out longtime residents to make room for vacation developments. They'd heard about the Cedar Ridge situation and wanted to know if I'd be willing to consult on their case. I wrote back explaining that I wasn't in the consulting business, but I suggested they might want to start by checking the original property deeds and development agreements in their area. Sometimes the best weapons against bullies are hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to dig them up and put them to good use. And sometimes the best revenge is simply giving people exactly what they ask for, the full force of the law, applied fairly and completely, without any of the mercy they never bothered to show you.